Hello everyone and welcome back. This time around we will be taking a look at middleware and filters, when to use which, how you could create one yourself, and why the filters were one of the hottest topic in .NET 6 and .NET 7. My name is Vasily Olenik and this video is part of the Minimal API course series, where we are building a REST API that will serve as the backend for a habit tracker application. So, straight off the bat, why would you use filters and why would you use middleware? General answer here and really opinionated. Basically, I would use middleware if I have some behavior that I can spread across all API endpoints that I'm using. For example, some exception handling. And I would use filters in case I need some granular control over a specific set of API endpoints. If you have some general behavior, use middleware. If you have some specific behavior for a specific subset of APIs, you should probably use filters. Let's get straight to some code samples. Probably in your application you would have seen something like this. Use exception handler, and over here we would pass an error or something like this. Then you could have, for example, use developer exception page or stuff like this, or some similar stuff. Basically, these are middlewares that you would use in your applications. Well, how could you build one yourself? Basically, everything that has use, like use exception handler, use authorization, use course, use endpoints, is really a notation to middleware. So you would have something like this, and then over here pass an async method, and over here we would have context, add delegate, and then like this. And over here we would run it like this: await, next, and pass in the HTTP context. Basically, this is the easiest sample of a middleware where we can do something over here and then do something over here as well. So let me do a small change over here. So console write line executing method, and over here console write line executed method. Now if I just make it a little bit smaller, run it in debug mode and open Postman at the same time, I can send a request. Just give it a second to start, and if I send it over here, it executed the method. Well, basically it entered the middleware, wrote executing the method, and then wrote the second part. So this is really the most basic example of a middleware where you could add some custom behavior. But yeah, this is not the most elegant solution of the all. We could go with the old route of creating a specific class. So I'm going to add over here a directory, infrastructure, where I'm going to add a small class like request logging middleware. I'll paste some code that I've pre-written over here, so don't waste time. Okay, so this is basically how a normal middleware would look like. So we have a class that would have this one specific method, which is called invoke async. This method accepts an HTTP context. And over here we have basically the same thing as before, just that we are using an injected iLogger instance. Yeah, middleware supports dependency injection, so it's wired up to the container itself, to the DI container itself. So you can use dependency injection in those. So just to demonstrate it, I'm going to put a breakpoint over here, and in our application we would wire up our middleware just like we did in previous .NET versions. Basically with use middleware, and over here request logging middleware. So if I run it like this and run it in debug mode, Now let me get my Postman back, and once the application starts, I'm going to run a request that would hit our middleware. Yeah, and here we go. So basically we have it here. If I put a breakpoint over here, it gets to the second part as well. Pretty neat, yeah? Okay. Tips and tricks I've seen online is basically if you have use exception handler and then you pass a route error, basically you can enhance this by using a map error, and then over here you would use resolves.problem. You would show that you have a problem details, you would return a problem details response. This is not really neat since I don't know what the error was, I just get that there was a problem. For example, I've seen a couple of code bases where people would use an app map URL, something like this, and in problem details import missing. This sample over here is better shown than just talked about, so I'll be running it. And in Postman, let me just duplicate tab, and over here not a valid URL. So basically you can request it and it would return a 404 not found instead of the default response. So you can customize that any invalid path would return a a problem details response. And it's just like this. But this is not really middleware. This is basically just an endpoint definition that you are going to use. So I'm going to remove it for now. We'll customize it later in the course. There is one more thing that you should pay attention to is the order, since the order matters when it comes to filters and middleware. The order in which you define those in your program.cs or some of your custom installers is the order that the request will go through. Summing it all up, first, the order is really important. Second, use middleware whenever you have some general behavior. And third, old ways of working with the middleware and defining middleware are still viable inside the minimal APIs. Next on the line, filters. They're very similar to middleware in regards to how they behave. Basically, they add some behavior before execution, method execution, and after it. The only difference, well, the most important difference is that you have granular control over specific API endpoints. And if we take a look at codebase, the easiest filter to do is, for example, we have an endpoint that would look like this. So we would have a string name and we would return a hello name. And over here we can add a new filter by using this extension method that is EndpointFilter. Over here we have two parameters. It's EndpointFilter invocation context, which usually in documentation you can find an ASFI context, and as well a delegate that we will use to run the next filter in the pipeline. So over here we just return await next and pass in the FE context. This is basically how you would create an endpoint filter, which is pretty similar to how you would create a middleware. So yeah, if you can see the similarities over here, you can do stuff over here. The difference, you might have result equals like this, do stuff over here, and then just return result. So yeah, it's really similar to how middleware works, but if you can see it, as you can see it, it applies only to this specific endpoint. And just the same as with the middleware, we can define our filters in specific classes. So for example, we are going to use a validation filter. Validation was one of the breakpoints for me when minimal APIs first shipped without the filters, since I didn't have a centralized way of validating the payloads. And right now we can do that pretty easily. So for example, we have validation filter of t, and I need to inherit from EndpointFilter, where t is class in our case. So I'm going to implement this interface, as well as the middleware. Validation filters are directly wired up to the DI container. So over here I can do stuff like this. So private read-only validator of t, validator, and just instantiate it from the constructor. Next, what we are going to do is make this method async. Now comes the fun part, basically the endpoint filter invocation context that we can use to get access to the arguments that were passed to the API endpoint. So what we can do over here is basically get the validatable entry. Now what we can do next is basically just check if is null, so return results, or let's say a bad request. So yeah, if we don't find it and it was specified that it needs to be validated, just short circuit it and prevent further execution. So next is the usual stuff, validation result, where we have the validator validate async. We can do that and just paste validatable over here. Await this call is valid, negate it, and over here return results dot bad request. Yeah, let's say validation result error select error message to list, and then aggregate. If I'm not wrong, this would just aggregate all the error messages into a specific list, which for a proof of concept is pretty okay. And the rest would be just return, await, next, and pass in the AFI context. Sorry, like this. So this is basically a validation filter, a basic generic validation filter that we can apply to our endpoints. And the way we apply it is, for example, we have over here await, add endpoint filter, validation filter, and over here, which is not really a good example, habit DTO, so let me just cut it from here and apply it over here. So like this, we will be validating the habit DTO model that will be passed to our add habits async API method. We can as well use multiple filters on our API endpoints, which is basically the whole idea. So you will stack these filters one on top of another to create a pipeline for your API methods. Now let's go over one more interesting feature that was introduced in .NET 7, which is road groups. If you see over here, we have this part of API v1.habits that's basically repeating itself in most, if not all, besides this one, since it doesn't need to be here. Basically in all API methods that we have defined over here. So we could group them together. So first of all, I don't have to define this route all over again in every API endpoint. And then we can as well apply filters to all the API methods inside specific blocks of code, inside specific groups. So for example, we could have app.map group, and over here define it like ap v1 habits, assign it to a variable habit group equals like this, and then we could use this variable, for example, to do it like this, and just remove this one over here. Now I should be able to run this request just the same. So as you can see, it went straight up to the method itself. So yeah, basically map group would allow us to consistently apply filters to a set of API endpoints if we want that. Now there is one more question over here that I would like to address is basically in some cases we might not need a filter on specific methods from a method group, from a route group. For example, inside the get method, we don't really need to run the validator as the validator will just throw a bad request over here. And for these cases, we have a new feature, is the endpoint validation factory that was introduced as well with .NET 7. I'll paste the working copy of code over here just to show you how it would look like, and let me just arrange it a little bit. So basically inside this extension method we have access to the endpoint filter factory context. What's that? It's basically an easy access to the arguments to the method information that's for the said endpoint. And in here, for example, we are taking the method info, from there we're getting the parameters, and we are checking if there is any kind of parameter type that's of type habitDTO. If yes, we are registering a new validation filter, we are creating a new validation filter, and we are passing it there. If there is not any habitDTO inside the path itself, we are adding a pass-through filter that would just go through it to the next one. And this way we would register filters only for the API methods from the method group that, well, to the API methods that need this validator inside this one habit group. Yeah, that was all for today. So in the next video we will be taking a look at Swagger and how to configure it for the endpoints, how to extend it, and some tips and tricks around Swagger itself. So stay tuned and see you next time. Bye.